The year is 1855. Nicholas I, autocrat of all the Russias, lies dead. His reign, marked by repression and military might, ends with the bitter taste of defeat in the Crimean War. His son, Alexander II, inherits a throne shaken, an empire humbled. The Crimean War, fought against Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, exposed Russia's weaknesses. Outdated tactics, technological backwardness, and a rigid social order all contributed to the humiliating loss. Alexander II, I understood the need for change. The Crimean War was not just a military defeat, it was a blow to Russia's prestige and a stark revelation of its internal problems. The calls for reform, whispered in the shadows during my father's reign, now echoed throughout the empire. I knew I could not ignore them. I had to modernize Russia or risk its decline on the world stage. The system of serfdom, which bound peasants to their landlords, stifled economic growth and social mobility. On March 3, 1861, Alexander II signed the Emancipation Manifesto, a document that would forever alter Russian society. He abolished serfdom, freeing millions from forced labor. The Emancipation Edict was a watershed moment in Russian history. Liberals hailed it as a triumph, while conservatives saw it as a betrayal. Peasants gained freedom but had to buy land from landlords. This often left them burdened by debt. Many former serfs moved to urban centers seeking new opportunities. The Emancipation Edict was the catalyst for Russia's transformation. While the Emancipation Edict was a cause for celebration, the reality for many peasants was far from idyllic. The land they received was often insufficient or of poor quality. The redemption payments, spread over decades, were a heavy burden. Many found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty. The social upheaval caused by emancipation led to tensions between former serfs and their former landlords. The government, aware of the challenges, implemented measures to assist peasants in their transition to freedom. These included the establishment of rural banks and the provision of agricultural training. However, these measures were often inadequate, hampered by bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption. Despite the difficulties, the abolition of serfdom had a profound psychological impact on the Russian peasantry. They had a voice, however small, in their own destiny. The winds of change also swept through the Russian legal system. Alexander II, recognizing the archaic and often brutal nature of justice in his empire, introduced a series of reforms aimed at creating a more modern and equitable system. In 1864, new judicial statutes were enacted, establishing the principle of equality before the law. This meant that all subjects, regardless of their social standing, were to be treated equally in the eyes of the court. One of the most significant innovations was the introduction of trial by jury. This reform, inspired by Western legal systems, aimed to ensure greater transparency and fairness in the judicial process. Previously, trials were often held in secret, with little opportunity for the accused to defend themselves. The new system, while not without its flaws, represented a significant step towards a more just society. Judges were granted greater autonomy, and their decisions were no longer subject to the whims of local officials or the aristocracy. The Crimean War had exposed the glaring deficiencies of the Russian military. Alexander II, determined to restore Russia's military prestige, embarked on a series of reforms aimed at modernizing the armed forces. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of universal military conscription in 1874. This replaced the previous system, which relied heavily on the recruitment of serfs, who often served for life. Under the new system, all male citizens, regardless of their social status, were required to serve in the military for a fixed period. This created a larger and more representative army, although it also led to resistance from some segments of society who resented the disruption to their lives. The reforms also focused on improving training, updating equipment, and adopting new military technologies. Alexander II and his military advisors sought to instill a greater sense of professionalism and patriotism among the officer corps. Military academies were reformed, and promotion was increasingly based on merit rather than social connections. Recognizing that a modern society required an educated citizenry, Alexander II's reforms also extended to the realm of education. Prior to his reign, education in Russia was largely limited to the elite. Alexander II sought to expand access to education for all, regardless of social class. New universities were established, and existing ones were granted greater autonomy. The curriculum was modernized, with a greater emphasis on science, mathematics, and modern languages. The government also encouraged the establishment of primary and secondary schools, particularly in rural areas where access to education was limited. These reforms, while not immediately transformative, laid the groundwork for the development of a more educated and skilled workforce. Conservative elements within Russian society viewed the spread of education with suspicion, fearing that it would lead to social unrest. Alexander II's reforms, while sweeping in scope, faced numerous challenges. The vastness of the Russian Empire, with its diverse population and deeply ingrained social structures, made implementing change a daunting task. Bureaucratic inertia, corruption, and resistance from conservative elements within the government and the nobility hindered the effectiveness of reforms. The emancipation of the serfs, while a moral triumph, created economic and social dislocations that took decades to resolve. The newly freed peasants often lacked the skills and resources to thrive in a market economy. The rapid industrialization and urbanization that accompanied the reforms led to new social problems, including poverty, crime, and the rise of radical ideologies. Despite these challenges, Alexander II remained committed to modernization. As with any period of profound change, Alexander II's reforms generated a backlash. While some embraced the new freedoms and opportunities, others felt threatened by the pace and direction of change. Conservative elements within the nobility and the bureaucracy saw their power and privileges eroding. They longed for a return to the old order, where their dominance was unquestioned. At the same time, a new generation of radicals emerged, inspired by Western ideas of socialism and anarchism. They viewed Alexander's reforms as half-measures, insufficient to address the fundamental inequalities of Russian society. They demanded more radical change, including the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a socialist state. The government's response to this growing opposition was a mix of repression and concession. Censorship was tightened, and political dissent was brutally suppressed. Alexander II's legacy is complex and contradictory. He is remembered as the Tsar liberator for emancipating the serfs, earning admiration worldwide. His judicial, military, and educational reforms modernized society. Yet he was an autocrat who ruled with an iron fist. His top-down reforms led to resentment and unintended consequences. On March 13, 1881, he was assassinated by revolutionaries. His death marked the end of an era, giving way to reaction and repression. Alexander II's assassination sent shockwaves through Russia. His son and successor, Alexander III, a staunch conservative, blamed his father's reforms for the unrest and violence that had plagued his reign. He embarked on a program of counter-reforms, rolling back many of the liberal measures implemented by his father. Censorship was tightened, the powers of the secret police were expanded, and the autonomy of universities was curtailed. The emancipation process was slowed, and measures were taken to strengthen the authority of the nobility. Alexander III's reign marked a return to the autocratic traditions of his grandfather, Nicholas I. The hopes for a more liberal and democratic Russia, ignited by Alexander II's reforms, were dashed. The seeds of change had been sown, and they would continue to germinate in the minds of the Russian people. The echoes of Alexander II's reforms would continue to resonate in the decades to come, fueling the revolutionary movements that would ultimately topple the Romanov dynasty. Even today, more than a century after his death, Alexander II's legacy continues to be debated. His reforms, while flawed and ultimately cut short, represent a pivotal moment in Russian history. They mark a turning point, a brief but significant period in a society long dominated by autocracy and tradition. The echoes of his reforms, the ideals of freedom, justice, and progress, continue to resonate in modern Russia. The challenges faced by Alexander II, the need to modernize, to balance reform with stability, to address the demands of a changing society, are challenges that Russia continues to grapple with today. The legacy of his reforms, both the achievements and the unfulfilled promises, serve as a reminder of the complexities of change and the enduring quest for a more just and equitable society. The story of Alexander II's reforms is a reminder that progress is rarely linear. It is a story that continues to shape Russia's past present and future.